Imagine the most tense, high-stakes conflict you have ever witnessed in your entire life. Just try to picture a moment where reputations were completely on the line, egos were profoundly bruised, and tempers were absolutely combustible.
Oh, yeah. We all have that one scenario that instantly springs to mind.
Right. I mean, perhaps you're picturing a modern corporate boardroom.
Definitely.
Like a massive multi-million-dollar merger is just falling apart in real time because two CEOs fundamentally insulted each other in front of their respective executive teams.
Or maybe it's something much more intimate.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You might be thinking of a deep-seated family dispute, the kind that spans generations, where one careless, really sharp word at a holiday dinner table is about to permanently sever relationships that took decades to build. We've all been in the room.
Or at least near the room.
Yeah, near the room when the air gets thick, the temperature rises, and you just get that sinking feeling in your stomach that someone is about to make a catastrophic decision that they can never, ever take back.
It's a terrifying dynamic to watch unfold.
Yeah.
Because you can almost see the tunnel vision setting in on the people involved.
You really can.
When human beings feel deeply disrespected or threatened, our biology just completely takes over the driver's seat.
Right, the rational brain just shuts off.
Exactly. The rational forward-thinking part of our brain shuts down. The amygdala fires up the fight-or-flight response into high gear, and suddenly logic, future consequences, and basic empathy are completely out the window.
Just gone.
Gone. And escalation happens in the blink of an eye. I mean, one moment, it's a disagreement over contract terms or, I don't know, seating arrangements. And the next moment, people are literally burning their entire lives down just to prove a point or defend their pride.
That rapid, terrifying escalation is the core of what we are going to be unpacking today. So, welcome to the deep dive. We are opening up a really fascinating piece of source material today. We're looking at the insights drawn from an essay titled Abigail, a blending of spiritual wisdom and human protocol, written by Brother Woody Brahm.
It's an incredible piece of writing.
It really is. And, when I first started looking at this material, my initial thought was that we were just going to be looking at a piece of ancient history. We're exploring a story from the ancient text of 1 Samuel, specifically chapter 25.
Yeah.
But the mission of our deep dive today goes so far beyond just a simple historical recap.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
What we have in these sources is an absolute masterclass in de-escalation.
Yes. What the analysis does so brilliantly is break down how one woman, Abigail, managed to stop a literal massacre from taking place. And she didn't do it by raising a larger army to counter the threat.
Right.
And she didn't do it through some sort of miraculous supernatural intervention where fire falls from the sky.
No. She accomplished this with a breathtakingly brilliant combination of sharp human psychology, which the source material refers to as protocol, and a very deep, firmly grounded spiritual wisdom.
She just understood people.
She understood human nature, she understood the cultural levers of her time, and she understood exactly how to interrupt the destructive momentum of angry men.
It really seems like the ultimate playbook for turning what the analysis calls a blood path into a blessing. And we want to bring this directly to you, the listener. Because whether you are navigating a hyper-competitive, cutthroat workplace, or maybe you're trying to mediate a complex community dispute,
Or just trying to understand the basic mechanics of human conflict.
yes, just figuring out how to cool down irrationally angry people. Abigail's story is directly applicable to you. It takes place in an ancient agrarian setting, yes, but the human ego, the fragility of male pride, and the actual mechanics of anger haven't changed a bit in 3,000 years.
They really haven't. We're dealing with the exact same hardware.
Exactly. So to really grasp the magnitude of what she accomplishes, we have to start by setting the scene. We cannot understand the explosion if we don't first understand the powder keg. Paint a picture for me of the world we are stepping into.
Well, to understand why this specific situation was such a volatile powder keg, we have to look closely at the economics and the cultural expectations of the time. The sources anchor us in the rugged highlands of ancient Judah during a very specific, highly charged time of year.
Which is what?
Sheep shearing time.
Okay, see, to a modern listener, sheep shearing time probably just sounds like an agricultural chore. You picture a Tuesday on a farm, just a mundane task of trimming some wool.
Right, but the historical context makes it clear that we need to completely adjust our lens. In the ancient Near East, shearing time functioned as a massive industry milestone, a financial payout, and a cultural festival all rolled into one.
So we're not talking about a quiet afternoon in the barn. This is more like it's the end of the fiscal year when all the massive corporate bonuses are being paid out, combined with the biggest community-wide holiday gala of the season.
That is a highly accurate comparison. It was a big deal. In this agrarian culture, when a wealthy landowner, in the case of our story, a man named Nabal, was shearing his massive flocks of sheep, it meant he was literally cashing in his major crop for the year.
Payday?
Massive payday. It was a time of immense tangible abundance. Wealth was measured in livestock, and shearing was the moment that wealth was processed and realized. And with that kind of visible, overwhelming abundance came very strict, deeply ingrained social expectations.
What kind of expectations?
Well, landowners would feast their workers to celebrate the harvest, but they were also culturally obligated to distribute gifts and provisions to their neighbors, and crucially, to their benefactors.
This sounds like a system where generosity is not just a nice character trait, but it's a mandatory public performance.
Oh, entirely.
If you are hoarding your wealth during the shearing festival, you aren't just being thrifty or frugal, you are violating a core social contract.
You're breaking the rules of society. It was a massive public signal of your honor, your social status, and your piety. To refuse hospitality or to act stingy during a shearing festival was completely socially unacceptable. It was expected, almost demanded by the culture, that a wealthy man would set an open table.
It was how you proved you were part of the community.
Exactly. It was how you maintained your standing and showed that you recognized the interconnected nature of survival in a really harsh landscape.
Which brings us to the other major player in this scenario, the catalyst for the conflict, before Abigail even enters the picture. We have David.
Right.
Now, the context here is vital because David is not yet the legendary king sitting comfortably on a throne in Jerusalem.
No, not at all.
He is essentially a political exile. He is running a powerful mobile militia out in the unforgiving wilderness. He has a highly trained force of about 400 to 600 men with him. And the analysis points out something fascinating about the relationship between David's militia and Nabal's massive agricultural enterprise.
The security aspect.
Yes. David's men had been providing what is termed uncontracted security for Nabal's flocks throughout the year. How does that kind of arrangement even work back then?
Well, in the rugged wilderness of Judah, there were constant existential threats to a shepherd and his flock. You had the natural predators, of course, lions, bears, wolves.
Sure.
But the much larger threat came from human raiding parties. There were bandits, nomadic tribes, and opportunistic thieves constantly looking to steal livestock, which, as we established, was the equivalent of stealing stacks of cash.
Right, walking money.
Exactly. So David and his men, who were living and maneuvering out in this exact same wilderness, essentially acted as a heavily armed, highly effective neighborhood watch. They formed a perimeter.
I noticed a specific detail in the text where Nabal's own shepherds later testify about the conduct of David's men. They use a really evocative metaphor, describing David's company as a wall around them, night and day.
That metaphor of the wall is crucial. We really need to pay attention to that.
Why is that?
It tells us that David's men weren't just passively existing in the same area. They actively, intentionally protected Nabal's assets. They were a vigilant, disciplined force. And keep in mind, a hungry, displaced army of 400 men could very easily have preyed upon those flocks themselves.
Oh, easily. They had the kinetic power to take whatever they wanted.
But they didn't. They exercised restraint and provided a highly valuable service. The clear implication is that a significant portion of Nabal's immense prosperity that year, the very wool he is currently hearing and the profits he is celebrating, owed its existence directly to the fact that David's men served as that protective wall against raiders.
So when shearing time arrives and David hears that Nabal is throwing this massive festival and cashing in the crop that David's men helped protect, David sends a delegation.
He does.
He sends his messengers to ask for some provisions. And from a modern perspective, this is where it can get a little confusing for us.
Yeah, it can sound a bit off.
Right. To someone today, this might sound a bit like a mafia shakedown. You know, nice flock of sheep you've got here. It would be a real shame if something happened to it.
Right.
But the analysis pushes back on that interpretation pretty strongly.
It does, because the context of ancient Near Eastern custom completely changes the dynamic of that request. Because David's forces provided this uncontracted but highly effective security, custom dictated that his request for provisions during the festival was highly appropriate and deeply respectful.
It wasn't extortion.
Not at all. It was an established, expected part of the patronage system. A wealthy patron was culturally required to acknowledge the service of a protective force. especially during a time of feasting. Sending food to those who protected your livelihood was the honorable fulfillment of an unspoken contract. To refuse was to break the social code.
So David's messengers arrive and they deliver a very respectful greeting. They wish shalom, deep, holistic peace to Nabal, his house, and all that he has. They politely remind him of the protective conduct they provided throughout the season, and they ask for whatever Nabal can spare on this feast day.
It's a perfect request.
It really seems like a textbook, polite, culturally flawless request. And the response they get is what lights the fuse. How does Nabal react to these messengers?
Nabal responds with a venomous, calculated dismissal. He sneers at the messengers and says, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse?" Many servants are breaking away from their masters these days.
Wow.
He doesn't just say no to the food, he attacks David's identity and his honor.
The audacity of that is almost hard to process. He is asking, who is David, as if he has never heard of the guy, but there is no way that is true, is it?
It is entirely impossible that it was ignorance. David had a massive rising reputation across the entire region. He was the famous warrior who had defeated the Philistine champion Goliath. He had been a commander in King Saul's army. Songs were literally sung about his military victories in the streets. Everyone knew exactly who the son of Jesse was.
So when Nabal asks, who is David?
It is a deliberate, theatrical belittling. He is publicly denying David's status. By comparing him to a runaway servant, he is stripping this anointed, famous warrior of all his dignity and treating him like a rebellious runaway slave.
It is the ultimate ancient equivalent of looking someone up and down and saying, I don't know who you are and you don't matter.
Exactly.
It is designed to maximize the feeling of disrespect. And to fully grasp why this specific insult is so dangerous, we have to talk about the concept of an honor-shame culture.
This is key.
Because in our modern Western society, we operate largely on a guilt-innocence framework. We care about legal rights, contracts, and individual internalized feelings. But in the world we are discussing, the rules are entirely different.
Completely different. In an honor-shame culture, your public face, your reputation, is not just about your ego. It is your literal currency.
Right.
It dictates your safety, your ability to form alliances, and your survival. If you are publicly shamed and you do not respond to restore your honor, you are signaling to everyone in the region that you are weak and vulnerable. How you received someone's messengers in the ancient world was understood to be exactly how you received the person who sent them.
The messengers were extensions of the leader.
Exactly.
So by insulting these envoys, humiliating them, and sending them away empty-handed from a massive feast, Nabal isn't just turning down a catering request. He is directly, publicly spitting in David's face.
He turned a joyful, customary transaction into a devastating public loss of face for a man leading 400 hardened warriors. When men carry swords and their survival depends on their fearsome reputations, public face is highly combustible. You cannot humiliate a warlord in front of his men and expect it to end peacefully.
The social fabric demands a response.
It demands it.
And the response from David is immediate and terrifying. The text highlights a visceral, violent reaction. David doesn't take a moment to strategize or say, well, Nabal's an arrogant fool, let's just go hunt some deer for dinner and ignore him. What is his immediate command to his men?
His command is chillingly brief. He just says, put on your swords.
Just 4 words.
And 400 heavily armed, battle-tested men mobilize for swift, total retribution. David is so consumed by the insult that he makes a terrifying formal oath. He swears that by morning he will not leave a single male alive who belongs to Nabal's household.
He's going to wipe them all out.
He is planning to wipe out the entire estate. Nabal, his innocent servants, the shepherds who just praised David's protection, everyone.
It is a complete escalation from zero to genocide in a matter of hours. It is fascinating how fast righteous indignation over a legitimate grievance devolves into this blind, personal, unrestrained vengeance. Because David was, theoretically, in the right.
He was.
He had a legitimate cultural grievance. He was wronged. But his reaction completely strips away his moral high ground.
The untempered reaction is what turns a dispute over provisions into an impending massacre. David's honor has been deeply wounded, and his immediate, unthinking instinct is to heal that psychological wound with overwhelming physical violence.
He's not thinking clearly at all.
Not at all. The restraint, the wisdom, the reliance on divine justice that normally characterized his leadership has completely evaporated in the heat of his bruised ego. He's operating entirely out of the amygdala.
So the collision course is set, the timer is ticking. On one side, you have Nabal, who is completely oblivious to the doom he has just invited. He's likely drinking at his own massive festival, probably boasting to his friends about how he really put those wilderness upstarts in their place.
Oh, undoubtedly.
And on the other side, you have David riding furiously across the rugged terrain with an army, consumed by red-hot anger, ready to commit mass murder over a public slight. It is an absolute nightmare of unchecked male ego and impending violence. And into this exact terrifying gap steps the central figure of our deep dive. Enter Abigail.
The entrance of Abigail shifts the entire narrative from a tragedy of foolish pride into a masterclass in crisis intervention. The source material draws a very stark, intentional contrast right at the beginning of the story. Nabal is described as a man of great wealth, but he is harsh, surly, and mean in his dealings. Even his name, Nabal, literally translates to fool or senseless.
He is the embodiment of wealthy arrogance.
Yes, but his wife, Abigail, is introduced as an intelligent and beautiful woman.
That pairing is such an incredible, tragic irony. The man who holds all the positional power, all the financial leverage, and all the societal authority is a complete fool who has just signed a death warrant for his entire household.
Right.
Meanwhile, the woman, who operates within the strict, limiting constraints of an ancient patriarchal society, is the one holding the actual intelligence, the tactical awareness, and the agency required to save them all. Let's talk about her agency, because the way she moves into action is staggering. How does she even find out about this impending doom?
The news comes to her through one of Nabal's young servants. This servant clearly recognizes that his master is a walking disaster. He bypasses the chain of command entirely and runs directly to Abigail. He testifies to her that David's men were, in fact, incredibly good to them.
He confirms the story.
He confirms the reality that they were a wall of protection and never stole a thing. Then he delivers a chilling assessment of the situation. He tells Abigail that disaster is currently hanging over the entire household, and he explicitly states why he came to her instead of his master. He says Nabal is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him.
No one can talk to him.
Yeah.
That one sentence reveals so much about the toxic environment Abigail was navigating every single day. She is bound to a man who is completely unteachable, deeply entrenched in his own narcissism, and completely isolated from reality because he refuses to listen to anyone. The analysis uses the word intransigent.
It's the perfect word for him.
So she receives this terrifying intelligence briefing from the servant. 400 men are coming to kill everyone. What is her immediate response?
What stands out immediately is her speed and her absolute independence. She does not hesitate. She doesn't call a committee meeting of the estate managers to debate their options. She doesn't form a crisis management task force. And most importantly, she does not go to her husband to ask for permission or to try to reason with him.
She just bypasses him completely.
She knows that consulting an unteachable fool like Nabal would only waste precious time, escalate his anger, or result in her being explicitly forbidden to take action.
The text explicitly notes that she acts without informing Nabal. She realizes that the normal rules of protocol and hierarchy have to be suspended if they are going to survive. The analysis describes her action as operating with prayer-soaked judgment and incredible velocity. She instantly begins to assemble an intercept mission.
Her speed is incredible.
And the logistics of what she pulls together in what must have been just a few hours are mind-blowing. The source material spends a surprising amount of time detailing the exact inventory of what she packs.
The narrator of the biblical text lingers deliberately over the list of gifts because it stresses the sheer weight, the massive scale, and the phenomenal readiness of her response. She doesn't just grab a few baskets of leftovers.
No, she gathers 200 loaves of bread, 2 large skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep ready to cook, 5 seahs of roasted grain, 100 raisin cakes, and 200 fig cakes.
We need to pause and visualize the scale of this.
Yeah, what exactly is a seah of roasted grain?
A seah is an ancient unit of measurement, roughly equivalent to a third of an ephah, or about 2.5 to 3 gallons.
Yeah.
So 5 seahs is well over 10 gallons of prepared roasted grain.
That is a staggering amount of food. When you add that to the 200 loaves of bread, the 5 fully prepared sheep, the massive concentrated caloric energy of 300 pressed fruitcakes, this is not a polite fruit basket or a token apology gift.
Not at all.
This is an industrial-scale catering order mobilized at lightning speed. To have this ready to go, to know exactly what is in the massive estate pantries, and to be able to command the servants to load it onto a caravan of donkeys, it shows that Abigail was an incredibly competent, brilliant manager of this vast enterprise. She knows exactly what it takes to physically feed a small army.
It is a phenomenal logistical feat, but the analysis takes it a critical step further. This massive mobilization of food isn't just about providing calories to hungry men. It explores the deeply ingrained concept of gift diplomacy in the ancient Near East.
Gift diplomacy.
Yes, when you needed to appease an approaching ruler, a warlord, or an offended party, it required generous, immediate gifts. But those gifts had a specific vocabulary. They had to communicate something profound. This massive convoy of food communicates absolute sincerity, and just as importantly, it communicates costliness. It visually demonstrates that she is taking the offense incredibly seriously.
The source material uses a brilliant phrase here. It calls this massive convoy of food theology embodied. It draws a connection to the later biblical principle that faith without deeds is dead.
Exactly.
Imagine if Abigail had just ridden out into the desert on a donkey with empty hands to meet David, and she just said, "David, I am so deeply sorry. My husband is a terrible, foolish man. Please find it in your heart to forgive us and let God's peace rule your heart." If she said that while David and his 400 men were standing there exhausted, disrespected, and starving, it would have been utterly meaningless.
It would have been worse than meaningless. It would have been insulting in its own way. Peacemaking in this context, without a tangible personal cost, is mere sentimentality. By bringing the bread, the roasted meat, the heavy skins of wine, she is proving her sincerity through action. She is physically blessing the very men who had been a wall of protection for her household. She is replacing her husband's verbal insult with overwhelming tangible provision.
It is the physical, undeniable manifestation of her wisdom. It shows that spiritual discernment and human protocol are deeply intertwined. You can't always just offer thoughts and prayers about a conflict. Sometimes you have to back it up by bringing the 200 loaves of bread.
Right.
You have to meet the physical, emotional, and cultural needs of the intense moment to even open the door for the spiritual truth to be heard.
She understands that you cannot reason with a starving, humiliated man. You have to address his honor and his physical needs first before you can address his soul.
So she packs up this massive logistical operation onto a caravan of donkeys, and she rides out. The narrative notes that she rides down into a mountain ravine, descending into a sheltered path. Meanwhile, David is marching aggressively toward her from the opposite direction, actively repeating his vows of vengeance, hyping himself up for the slaughter.
The cinematic tension of this moment is incredible.
It really is. You have the dust rising, the sound of marching warriors, the braying of the donkeys, and then, in the narrow ravine, the intercept happens. They finally come face to face. And this is where we dive into the profound psychology of physical posture. The physical movements Abigail makes before she even utters a single syllable are a masterclass in de-escalation.
Body language matters immensely, especially when you are suddenly face-to-face with a highly kinetic, high-threat situation. The analysis points out two deeply intentional physical choices Abigail makes the moment they intersect. First, she approaches riding a donkey. Why is that significant?
Why a donkey?
Because a donkey is fundamentally a beast of burden. It is an animal associated with peace, agriculture, and commerce. It's a completely non-threatening approach. She's not riding a majestic war horse or arriving with an armed guard. She is deliberately presenting herself as a civilian, a provider, someone entirely outside the realm of military combat.
And the second choice she makes is even more dramatic. As soon as she sees David, she doesn't sit tall on her mount and demand a parley. The text says she dismounts quickly. She falls on her face and bows completely to the ground. She puts her face in the dust at his feet. She places herself entirely, physically, at his mercy.
It is the standard, absolute gesture of extreme deference and submission in that ancient culture. But think about the profound psychological impact this has on David in that specific split second.
Right.
He has been marching across the desert, his adrenaline is spiking, his sword is drawn, and his mind is completely primed for a violent confrontation. He's expecting to face Nabal's armed guards, or perhaps Nabal himself, sneering at him again. His entire nervous system is braced for resistance.
And instead of encountering resistance to fight against, his momentum meets an absolute void. He encounters a beautiful, intelligent woman who immediately lowers herself to the dust before him, accompanied by a massive, honorable feast that answers his exact original request.
That physical posture of bowing completely to the ground lowers the temperature in the ravine before a single argument is made. It is a massive pattern interrupt. She completely short-circuits his combative momentum.
You can't fight that.
You cannot charge with a sword at a woman who is already bowing in the dirt offering you a feast. It forces his brain out of the fight-or-flight loop and demands that he pause and assess this totally unexpected reality.
She completely disarms a warlord without ever raising a weapon. And once she has secured that crucial pause, once the immediate kinetic threat of violence is momentarily suspended by her posture and her overwhelming provision, she finally speaks. The rhetoric of the speech she delivers is widely considered one of the most brilliant, layered, and rhetorically perfect arguments in recorded history. She begins her address by doing something that completely subverts all expectations of someone in a conflict. She actively takes the blame.
Her opening words are staggering. She says, "Pardon your servant's presumption. Please let me speak to you. Let the blame be on me alone, my lord." Now, this requires very careful psychological analysis. As the source material points out, she is absolutely not confessing to a sin she actually committed. She wasn't the one who hurled insults at David's messengers. She was probably managing the estate and didn't even know the interaction happened until the terrified servant ran to tell her. So why would she throw herself under the bus and take the blame for an offense she had no part in?
That is the million-dollar question. In almost any conflict today, the immediate instinct is self-preservation. It is to say, hey, don't look at me, I didn't do it. My husband is crazy, take it up with him. Why would she willingly volunteer to take the heat from an angry man with a sword?
Because she is speaking the profound vocabulary of intercession. By explicitly placing the blame on herself, she intentionally assumes the heavy burden of making peace. She places herself as the physical and moral buffer between a furious, heavily armed warrior and her foolish, stubborn husband.
It's an incredible move.
It is an incredibly brilliant rhetorical strategy because it does two things simultaneously. First, it acknowledges that a deep wrong has occurred, which completely validates David's anger. Second, it profoundly disarms him. How can he righteously strike down the person who is humbly apologizing, offering restitution, and who didn't even commit the original offense?
It creates an impossible moral dilemma for him. It forces him to stop and think. And the analysis draws a really profound overarching connection here. It notes that her action echoes a much broader, even gospel-level pattern found throughout Scripture. It is the deep theological pattern of the innocent willingly shouldering the burden of the guilty in order to build a bridge of reconciliation. She volunteers to carry a massive weight that isn't technically hers to carry, specifically to prevent cascading harm and to force open a path for a peaceful resolution. It is a deeply selfless act, but it is also an incredibly sharp tactical maneuver.
It is the absolute highest level of tactical empathy. She absorbs the kinetic energy of his anger, and once she has firmly established that she is taking full responsibility for managing the situation, she does something even more surprising. She transitions to naming the reality of her husband's behavior, but she does it with an incredibly specific surgical precision.
Yes. She totally throws Nabal under the bus to David, but she does it so elegantly. She says, please pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal. He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. She is looking David in the eye and saying, look, you were profoundly insulted by a man whose literal name translates to fool. What else did you expect from a fool?
It is almost humorous.
The sheer shock of a wife speaking so candidly and bluntly about her husband's idiocy to a hostile force must have been jarring.
The nuance that the source material highlights here is critical to understanding her success. She names the folly accurately, but she does it without poisoning the air with deep contempt. She doesn't launch into a long, bitter, emotional tirade about how awful it is to be married to Nabal. She simply states an objective fact that David already suspects to be true. Nabal is a fool.
And why does that work?
Because it further validates David's experience. It tells David, you are not crazy for being deeply offended. He really is that bad. He behaves this way to everyone.
But by naming it so calmly and objectively, she actually de-escalates the offense. She shows that you can maintain respect for the structure of authority because she is still out there risking her life advocating for the survival of her household without having to stay silent about obvious sin. And she proves that you can be completely candid about someone's terrible behavior without having to mirror their toxicity or hold them in seething contempt.
The analysis uses a brilliant phrase to summarize this. She does not flatter, she frames.
She frames. I love that.
She isn't trying to butter David up with false compliments or tell him what he wants to hear, and she certainly isn't insulting his intelligence by pretending Nabal is actually a misunderstood genius. She speaks the plain truth. This masterful interplay of truth and tact proves the point the author makes about the nature of true wisdom. Referencing the book of James, it notes that wisdom from above is first of all peaceable, and it is open to reason. Abigail is constructing a highly reasonable, logical, and honorable off-ramp for David to step down from his rage.
And this leads us to what I consider the absolute most powerful tool in her rhetorical arsenal. Once she has validated his anger through her posture, taken the burden of the negotiation onto herself, and named the objective reality of the fool they are dealing with, she executes a massive pivot.
The pivot is everything.
She takes the entire conversation, lifts it out of the dusty ravine, and points the lens directly toward God and toward David's long-term future.
This is the technique the analysis identifies as future casting, and it is an absolute masterstroke of psychological judo. She says to him, "The Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands."
Wait.
Pay very close attention to the tense she uses. She does not say, "Please, David, I am begging you, let the Lord keep you from bloodshed." She speaks as if his restraint has already happened. She speaks as if his decision to stand down is a foregone conclusion.
Break that down for me. If a guy is standing in front of you with a sword, why would you talk to him as if he has already put it away? How does that actually work to calm someone down?
It works because it leverages the human desire for a positive identity. The analysis notes that she places restraint into his mouth as an act of praise rather than a prohibition. Nobody, especially a powerful military leader with a highly fragile ego in a moment of crisis, wants to be told what they cannot do.
Right.
If she had wagged her finger and said, "Don't do this, David, it's a sin, you're behaving badly," his natural psychological defense mechanism would have been to double down and prove he could do whatever you wanted.
Because telling an angry man to calm down usually just makes him angrier. You are challenging his autonomy.
Precisely. Instead of challenging his autonomy, she frames his restraint as an act of divine providence that he is already wisely participating in. She essentially paints a picture for him. "Look how amazing God is, that he sent me here to intercept you and stop you from making a terrible mistake. And look how incredibly wise and godly you are for listening to this divine intervention." She hands him a fully formed narrative where backing down is not a sign of weakness or cowardice, but rather the heroic, godly, kingly choice.
That is staggering. She gives him a heroic, honorable narrative for backing down. She allows him to save face while totally reversing his course. That is a skill I think every single person alive could use in their relationship.
Yeah.
And she doesn't stop there. She pushes the timeline of her future casting even further out. She reminds him of God's overarching promise for his life. She speaks to him as if his future kingship over all of Israel is already a visible, tangible, settled reality. She declares that God will certainly make a lasting house for him. And then she delivers the rhetorical knockout punch. She says, "When the Lord has made you ruler over Israel, you do not want to carry the staggering burden of needless blood guilt from this day."
This specific element of future casting is the absolute crux of her intervention. She forcefully pulls David's perspective past the immediate, burning heat of the hour. In that specific moment in the ravine, David's wounded honor feels like the single most important thing in the entire universe. But she forces his prefrontal cortex back online by asking him to evaluate his current actions from the perspective of his future self.
She is basically asking him, fast forward 5 years, when you are the anointed king sitting on the throne in Jerusalem dispensing justice for an entire nation, do you really want the petty massacre of a foolish farmer's household on your permanent record? Do you want the foundation of your reign to be built on an act of petty, unrestrained vengeance against civilians?
She is demanding that a leader live today in light of tomorrow's calling. It is a breathtaking maneuver. She is treating him with the dignity of a king long before he ever wears a crown, and by treating him like a king, she creates an intense psychological pressure for him to act like one. She reminds him that his grand divine story is so much bigger than Nabal's pathetic insult. She effectively shrinks the offense by enlarging his destiny.
I am fascinated by how this ties into modern psychology. Because when we are caught up in intense conflict, we get incredibly myopic, we get tunnel vision, we only see the perceived slight, the passive-aggressive email that just landed in our inbox, the disrespectful comment someone made in a meeting. Abigail steps into that tunnel vision and says, look at the horizon. Look at the massive things God is doing in your life over the long term. Do not trade your future integrity and your peace of mind for a momentary 5-minute release of anger. She quite literally speaks the Lord's future into the present crisis until the crisis bows to it.
It is a holy practice. It steadies people who are spinning out of control, and we see the immediate results of this tactic. It completely, utterly works.
Which brings us to the immediate fallout and the bigger picture of what is happening in this text. What is David's reaction to this incredible, sweeping, multi-layered speech? The guy who was practically foaming at the mouth just an hour ago, swearing a blood oath to kill every male on the entire estate. He drops his sword. The analysis describes his reaction as one of total worship and relief.
It is a profound, total pivot in his demeanor. David doesn't just grudgingly say, fine, whatever, you brought a lot of bread, I won't kill your husband today. He is genuinely overwhelmed with gratitude. He explicitly blesses the Lord for sending her to intercept him. He blesses her discretion, her good judgment, and her brilliant tact. And he explicitly blesses her for keeping him from bloodshed and from avenging himself with his own hands. In that moment of clarity, he recognizes exactly how close he came to the edge of the moral cliff.
He sees the abyss he was about to step into.
Yes, he realizes he was about to commit a terrible atrocity that would have stained his conscience and his legacy forever. And he feels an overwhelming, washing sense of relief that he was stalked by her wisdom. He accepts the massive gift of provisions, fulfilling the cultural expectation, and he sends her home in peace. The entire crisis, which was minutes away from ending in mass murder, is completely diffused.
And we absolutely have to follow up on Nabal's fate because the narrative ties up that loose end in a very dramatic, almost cinematic way. Abigail goes back home after saving everyone. And what does she find? Nabal is feasting like a king in his house. He is completely drunk, absolutely oblivious to the fact that his brilliant wife just negotiated his survival with a 400-man hit squad in a desert ravine.
Unbelievable.
The source material notes that she shows incredible restraint once again. She waits until the morning when the wine has left him and he is completely sober to tell him what happened.
And the physiological reaction he has when she finally briefs him is telling. The text says that when she tells him how agonizingly close he came to total annihilation, his heart fails within him and he became like a stone. It reads very much like a massive stroke or a severe cardiac event brought on by the sudden sheer terror of realizing his own vulnerability. 10 days later, the text states that the Lord strikes him and he dies, and the ultimate outcome of the narrative. When David hears that Nabal is dead, he realizes God handled the vengeance for him, and he sends for Abigail and marries her.
So, David's hands remain clean. He gets to see that justice is ultimately served without him having to compromise his own moral standing or resort to butchery. Now, here is where the analysis we are exploring does something that I absolutely loved. It zooms out. It takes us from the dusty ravine, away from the immediate drama of the intercept, and looks at the macro-level structure of how the entire book of 1 Samuel is put together. The source material points out a fascinating sandwich structure regarding the specific story.
The literary framing of this narrative in the historical text is highly intentional and deeply theological. This chapter, the story of Nabal and Abigail in 1 Samuel 25, sits exactly, chronologically, between two other very famous, towering scenes in David's life. In the chapter right before this, chapter 24, David has the perfect opportunity to assassinate his pursuer, King Saul, in a cave, but he shows immense restraint and spares the king's life. Then, in the chapter immediately following our story, chapter 26, David sneaks into Saul's military camp at night and has the opportunity to kill Saul with his own spear while he sleeps. But again, he shows profound restraint and spares him, refusing to lift his hand against the Lord's anointed.
So it's a structural sandwich. You have an incredible display of restraint with Saul, then an absolute total lack of restraint with Nabal, and then another incredible display of restraint with Saul again. What is the deeper meaning here? What is the author suggesting God is doing by placing the specific failure temper right in the middle of these great victories of self-control?
The analysis argues that this structure reveals a divine curriculum at work. God is actively, intensely tutoring David on how not to seize the kingdom by force. David is being fashioned, tested, and molded into a ruler. But the text makes it clear that God does not want a ruler whose throne rests on a foundation of unchecked violence, petty vengeance, and fragile ego. God is seeking a ruler whose throne rests on righteousness and justice, a king who will act as a shepherd to the people, not a warlord who devours them the moment he is insulted.
It seems like David understood the theology of restraint perfectly well when he was dealing with King Saul, but Saul was the king. It is relatively easy to convince yourself that you shouldn't assassinate the reigning monarch. There's certain awe and established hierarchy there, but Nabal is just a guy. Nabal is just an arrogant, wealthy farmer who insulted him. It is a completely different kind of test, isn't it?
It is the test of the commoner versus the test of the king. It is easy to show restraint when the stakes are royal and historical. It is incredibly difficult to show restraint when someone you view as beneath you disrespects you to your face. In that moment with Nabal, David's personal pride completely overrides his theology. And this is where Abigail's role becomes so crucial in the grand narrative. She acts as the ultimate emergency instructor in this divine curriculum.
When David forgets his lessons, when his grand theology fails to connect to his immediate burning temper, God sends Abigail into the ravine. Her intervention physically preserves his hands from the stain of innocent blood. She aligns his heart forcefully back with the Lord's long-term plan. She ensures that he passes the test, even when he was fully prepared and mobilized to fail it spectacularly. She guards his future so that he can actually become the righteous shepherd king that Israel desperately needs.
This narrative highlights an incredibly stark, fascinating contrast in power dynamics, which the source material brings out beautifully. We're essentially looking at two very different kinds of power colliding in this story. On one side, you have Nabal. Nabal possesses massive wealth, he throws lavish banquets, he owns immense flocks, he has significant positional and financial power. But as the author points out, he has absolutely zero self-control. He is a fool whose unrestrained mouth and arrogant entitlement endanger his entire household. All of his vast wealth cannot save him from his own toxic personality.
And on the other side, you have David. David possesses overwhelming kinetic power. He has 400 loyal armed men at his back. He has incredible military momentum and a terrifying reputation. But in this critical moment, he completely lacks internal patience. His kinetic power is just a blunt instrument that is about to swing wildly out of control, simply because he lacks the internal discipline to govern his own emotional reactions to an insult.
So Nabal has soft, vulnerable, positional power. David has kinetic, deadly, but entirely undisciplined power. The analysis asks us to consider, where is the true power in this story?
It is clearly not with a wealthy fool, and it is clearly not with the raging warlord.
The true power is defined by the expert in the essay as self-mastery undergone. The author references the wisdom literature of Proverbs, which explicitly states that the one who rules his spirit is better than he who takes a city. True scriptural strength, true leadership power, is not defined by the ability to destroy your enemies or silence those who insult you. It is defined by the rule of the Spirit, producing patience, gentleness, and tactical self-control, especially in the exact moments when you are most provoked.
And Abigail is the absolute embodiment of that true, quiet strength. She is the only person in the entire narrative who is actually in control of the situation. The essay uses a beautiful phrase, calling her the means of grace that midwives that strength into David. She uses her immense intellect, her logistical resources, her understanding of protocol, and her deep theology to literally tame a raging warlord. That is real power.
It is the profound power of the active peacemaker. It is active, courageous, highly intelligent, and dangerous work. It is not the passive, timid avoidance of conflict. Peacemaking is riding a donkey down into a ravine to physically intercept the swords.
Which perfectly transitions us into the final phase of our deep dive. We have talked extensively about the ancient history, the economics of sheep shearing, the logistics of the donkeys, and the intricate military protocol. But let's bring this right into the listener's ear today. Let's connect this ancient text directly to modern life. I want to ask you, the listener, directly. How do you become the Abigail in your specific world, in your workplace, in your community organization, or in the complex dynamics of your family? When the powder keg is lit and the explosion is seconds away, how do you step into the gap? The source material has distilled this into some incredibly practical lessons, and we need to walk through them. First up on the modern playbook, speed without rashness.
This is a crucial, incredibly difficult distinction to master. In our daily conflicts, the author notes that the gap between an insult being delivered and a full-blown escalation is often just a matter of minutes, sometimes seconds. Think about a heated, high-stakes email thread at work. Someone sends a subtly disrespectful or passive-aggressive message, and the physiological urge to hit reply all with a glistering defensive takedown is immediate and overwhelming. The gap is tiny. Abigail teaches us that wise people move into that gap quickly, but they do not move rashly or blindly.
Right, she didn't just run out into the desert screaming in a panic. She prepared the food, she thought through her specific rhetorical approach, she planned her posture. She paired speed with what the author calls prayer-circed judgment.
Yes, she acted decisively within her sphere of influence, utilizing the resources she actually had control over, for the good of many. But the essay makes a very sobering, challenging point here. You cannot learn this specific habit in the middle of a crisis. The habit of intercession, the ability to instantly choose words that de-escalate rather than inflame, must be cultivated and learned before the crisis ever hits. It requires a mind consistently trained by wisdom and a heart trained by reverence. If you are constantly operating on a hair trigger of anxiety, defensiveness, and petty arguments in your daily life, you will not suddenly be able to channel Abigail's calm clarity when the massive conflict comes. You have to cultivate that internal quietness and readiness ahead of time.
Cultivate the readiness. That is powerful. The second major takeaway the author offers for modern application is the concept of pairing humility with honor. We touched on her posture earlier, but it's worth examining as a practical tool for today. The lesson is that you can bow, meaning you can show respect. You can lower the temperature in the room with your calm posture and your tone of voice and still speak the absolute hard truth.
We often present ourselves with a false, damaging dichotomy in conflict resolution. We tend to think we either have to be passive, silent doormats and let people act poorly just to keep the peace, or we have to be aggressive, brutal truth tellers who burn the entire house down just to prove we are right. Abigail completely destroys that false dichotomy. She willingly takes the blame to create the necessary room for mercy, but she absolutely unequivocally names the folly so that the reality of the situation is addressed.
The analysis argues that this specific combination equips people to speak into incredibly tense rooms without adding any unnecessary heat. It means you can be entirely candid about a failure, a mistake, or a sin without showing an ounce of contempt for the person who failed. You can respect the chain of command at your job, you can honor your boss, while still clearly and calmly pointing out a disastrous strategic error they are about to make. It is all about your posture. If your posture is genuinely one of service, humility, and seeking the best outcome for everyone, your hard truths will be received much more readily than if your posture is arrogant, combative, and focused on proving your own superiority.
The author notes that this specific pattern of combining humility and truth mirrors the ultimate example of wisdom in the biblical text. It is the ability to speak both grace and truth perfectly. You do not compromise the hard truth, but your grace makes that truth accessible and digestible to the hearer. Abigail models that delicate, profound balance beautifully in the ravine.
And the final practical application the essay highlights is the absolute necessity of valuing outside voices. It points out a glaring truth. Even an anointed, deeply gifted, highly experienced leader like David desperately needed correction. He was the hero of the broader biblical story up to this point. He had slain giants and led armies, but he still had a massive, potentially fatal blind spot when his ego was threatened.
This serves as a blaring warning siren for any community, any corporate leadership team, or any family structure. If your leader, or if you as a leader, cannot be corrected, you are operating in immense danger. The text shows us that God often preserves a future through the courage of someone who is entirely outside the normal, established chain of command. Abigail was not one of David's seasoned generals. She wasn't his appointed counselor. She was a complete stranger, a civilian, and technically the wife of his enemy. But she loved truth, she loved people, and she possessed the courage to speak up and interrupt his echo chamber.
The essay makes a compelling argument that communities and organizations must actively, intentionally cultivate an environment where Abigails are heard, valued, and blessed, not silenced or punished. If someone steps into your office or pulls you aside at a family gathering and says, "I think you are about to make a huge mistake based on your anger," your reaction shouldn't be to fire them for insubordination or attack them for being disloyal. The wise, mature response is to emulate David's reaction in the ravine, to humbly acknowledge the kindness of being warned, to actively bless their good judgment, and to stand down from your pride. A healthy, enduring leader knows deeply that they need guardrails, and they highly value the people who are brave enough to act as those guardrails.
Because the reality is, if you surround yourself exclusively with people who only ever agree with your anger and validate your grievances, you will eventually ride your horse right off a cliff.
That is a terrifyingly accurate image. Well, we have covered an immense amount of ground in this deep dive. As we begin to wrap up our exploration of this source material, let's quickly synthesize the incredible journey we have been on. We started by examining a volatile powder keg, an ancient honor-shame culture, a massive calculated insult during a time of high social expectations, and 400 armed men mobilized for swift, unchecked vengeance. And we watched in awe as a single intelligent woman stepped into the dangerous gap between them. We've seen how her mastery of cultural protocol, her rapid, prayerful judgment, her strategic willingness to confess a wrong she didn't even commit, and her brilliant future-casting candor managed to meet absolute kinetic rage on a desert road and send it home entirely empty-handed.
It is a narrative that definitively proves that true peacemakers are not naive, and they are certainly not weak. As the analysis concludes, they are highly skilled in both the deep language of heaven and the practical, complex customs of earth, and they bravely use both to guard lives and to preserve futures.
And as we prepare to leave you today, my insightful co-host has a final, deeply provocative thought for you to mull over. Something to really chew on as you go about the rest of your day and navigate your own conflicts.
I want you to reflect back on a specific metaphor we discussed early in this deep dive, the metaphor of the wall. Remember, David and his men prided themselves deeply on being a physical, intimidating wall of protection around Nabal's shepherds. They were the muscle. They kept the wolves, the lions, and the raiding bandits at bay. But look closely at how the story actually resolves. In the end, it wasn't David's physical prowess or his armed men that saved the day. In fact, the true danger wasn't coming from outside the camp at all. The greatest threat to David's life, his legacy, and his kingdom was coming directly from inside his own heart. His unrestrained anger and fragile ego were a far greater threat to his destiny than any Amalekite raider in the wilderness. In the grand scheme of this narrative, it was Abigail who became the ultimate invisible wall. She was the immovable wall that protected David from his own worst impulses. She was the wall that preserved his future, kept his hands clean of innocent blood, and saved him from himself.
Wow. She became the true wall for the man who thought he was the wall. That is an incredibly powerful inversion of the story. And so, we leave you with this final, direct call to reflection. Look at your own life right now. Who in your circle is acting as that invisible wall for now? Who is the person brave enough to stand in your way when you're acting out of anger, stress, or pride, saving you from your own reactionary instincts? Are you pausing to listen to them and bless their discretion, or are you trying to aggressively ride right past them? And perhaps even more importantly, whose future are you willing to step up and be a wall for? Where is the escalating conflict in your workplace, your community, or your family that desperately needs someone to ride down into the ravine with humility, hard truth, and a clear vision for a better future?
It takes immense courage and sharp wisdom to be an Abigail. But the harvest of peace and righteousness that follows is always worth the cost.
It truly is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope this extensive exploration into the ancient roots of wisdom, protocol, and conflict resolution has given you practical, powerful tools you can use in your own life. Taking the time to truly understand these psychological and spiritual dynamics is how we all learn to safely navigate the powder kegs around us. Until next time, stay curious and keep diving deep.